For more than a century, the skeleton seemed to settle the case. Across museums and textbooks, an extinct giant of Ice Age Europe stood beneath its own certainty, towering shoulders, long straight tusks, a skull and teeth that looked enough like those of Asian elephants to place it, confidently, on the Asian side of the family. The verdict felt stable. Europe's straight-tusked elephant was impressive, ancient, and understood. It wasn't. And that is where this story begins, not with a living herd moving through African brush, but with a dead animal in Germany, more than 100,000 years old, carrying inside its bones an argument that anatomy alone had missed. Because when scientists finally recovered ancient DNA from those remains, the result did not merely adjust a branch on the elephant family tree. It called the tree itself into question. The animal many researchers had linked to Asian elephants turned out to be far closer to the African forest elephant. And once that door opened, the deeper picture that followed was stranger still. Elephant origins were not neat, isolated, or cleanly divided. They were braided, entangled, and full of unexpected crossings. That matters for more than taxonomy. It changes how we understand one of the most iconic groups of animals on Earth. It changes the map of where elephant lineages moved. It changes the timeline of when they separated. It even changes what a species boundary means when traced across deep time. The familiar version of elephant history was elegant. There were living elephants in Africa and Asia, extinct mammoths in the north, mastodons farther back, and between them a branching sequence that seemed legible enough if you compared skulls, tusks, molars, and bones. Paleontologists had long relied on form because form was what the earth preserved best. Teeth especially became a kind of script. Elephant molars are distinctive, and for a long time they looked like trustworthy witnesses. So when the straight-tusked elephant, Paleoloxodon antiquus, appeared in the fossil record of Europe and Western Asia, its broad resemblance to Asian elephants helped place it within that world. The story seemed reasonable. A Eurasian elephant, related to Asian stock, adapted to landscapes that stretched from warm interglacial forests to the changing margins of the Ice Age. Then ancient DNA arrived like a second testimony from the same crime scene. Fragments were extracted from fossils found at German sites, including Neumark Nord and Weimar-Ehringsdorf, remains dating roughly to interglacial periods around 120,000 and more than 200,000 years ago. These were not complete genomes in the way people often imagine from modern genetics headlines, but they were enough. Enough to compare. Enough to ask whether the bones had been telling the truth. They had not. Or at least, they had not been telling the whole truth. Genetically, the straight-tusked elephant was not what its skeleton suggested. It aligned far more closely with the African forest elephant than with the Asian elephant. A creature that had walked prehistoric Europe, and that many had mentally filed as part of an Asian-looking lineage, was suddenly pulled back toward Africa. That alone would have been a major revision. But it was only the first. Because once researchers widened the genomic comparison across extinct and living elephant relatives, the pattern that emerged was even more destabilizing. Elephant evolution did not resemble a tidy ladder or even a tidy tree. It looked more like a landscape of lineages repeatedly separating and reconnecting. Gene flow, interbreeding between deeply diverged groups, was not a rare footnote. It was part of the main plot. The straight-tusked elephant itself appears to have carried a composite ancestry. In simple terms, it was not the product of one pure line moving unchanged through time. Its genome preserved signals from multiple ancient lineages, including connections to forest elephant-related ancestry and, more distantly, to mammoth-related ancestry as well. That means the old visual logic, this skull resembles that skull, therefore this species belongs neatly beside that species, was not just incomplete. In places, it was actively misleading. And now the mystery widens. If a giant elephant living in Europe could be more closely tied to African forest elephants than to Asian elephants, then the old geography of elephant history begins to break apart. Africa was not just the homeland of some elephant branches while Eurasia hosted separate descendants. At least some lineages moved out of Africa in ways that the conventional picture had badly underestimated. The Loxodonta line, the lineage associated today with African elephants, had not been confined to Africa after all. That is a remarkable reversal. But there is another one waiting behind it. Most people still speak of the African elephant as if it were one thing, one unmistakable species split perhaps into regional populations. Genetics has been dismantling that assumption too. African forest elephants and African savanna elephants are not just varieties of the same recent animal. They represent deeply separated lineages, with a divergence stretching back so far that the distance between them is older and more substantial than many non-specialists realize. In other words, the living elephants of Africa are not simply one branch standing opposite Asia. They are themselves survivors of a much older and more complex partition. The forest elephant, smaller, more elusive, shaped by dense Central African forests, is not just a reduced version of the savanna giant. It is a separate lineage with its own deep history. And that detail matters enormously, because when ancient European DNA points toward the forest elephant side of the family, it is not gesturing vaguely toward African elephants. It is pointing toward a very particular legacy. So the story has already changed twice. First, the extinct European straight-tusked elephant was not what morphology had led many to expect.
Second, the African side of the elephant family is itself much older and more internally divided than the simplified public picture suggests. And then comes the third turn, the one that reorders the whole cast. Asian elephants, genetically, are closer to woolly mammoths than either is to African elephants. That sounds surprising only because popular imagination tends to group mammoths with ancient elephants in a general sense, without asking which living species they actually sit nearest to. But the genomes are clear. The closest living relative of the woolly mammoth is the Asian elephant. So now step back and look at the shape of what that means. The extinct giant of Europe that looked Asian turns out to lean strongly toward African forest elephant ancestry. The living Asian elephant is more closely related to mammoths than to African elephants. The two African elephants are not one recent species at all, but two deeply distinct lineages. And several of these branches did not remain isolated anyway. They exchanged genes across time. This is no longer a conventional family portrait. It is a palimpsest, and that helps explain why older interpretations, even careful ones, could go wrong. Evolution can produce similar features in different lineages when they adapt to similar ways of life. Convergence can imitate kinship. A skull can resemble another skull because both are solving similar mechanical problems, chewing similar plants, supporting similar tusks, bearing similar mass, not because they share the nearest common ancestry. Bones matter, teeth matter, but DNA can expose histories that form alone cannot see. Halfway through the story, it becomes clear that the title question was almost too small. This is not just about where elephants came from. It is about what origin even means when a lineage does not proceed by clean separation. We like beginnings that stay behind us. A species appears, branches, and goes its own way. But elephant evolution seems to resist that comforting clarity. Lineages diverged, yes. Some remained separate for immense spans of time. But others met again. They overlapped. They left traces in one another. Their history was not a single outward march from an ancestral point. It was a series of departures and returns that reframes the straight-tusked elephant one more time. It is no longer merely a lost giant of Europe. It becomes evidence of a larger truth, that the elephant world was once far more connected and far more experimentally alive than the textbook diagram suggested. Ancient Africa did not just generate isolated descendants. It launched radiations, dispersals, and encounters whose consequences were still being written hundreds of thousands of years later in Eurasia. And the implications do not end in prehistory. If the surviving elephant species are the last remnants of a once much richer and more entangled family, then conservation is not only about preventing the disappearance of familiar animals. It is about preserving the final living archives of a very deep evolutionary experiment. When a forest elephant disappears, we do not lose one local population of a generic African elephant. We lose a lineage with its own ancient separateness, one that unexpectedly helps explain the identity of a vanished giant that once walked Europe. We lose one of the last interpreters of a history written across continents. That gives the modern elephant a different kind of weight. Not symbolic weight, not merely emotional weight, historical weight. A herd crossing a forest road in Central Africa is not just a present-day wildlife scene. It is part of a lineage that may illuminate why Europe once held colossal elephants whose ancestry was misunderstood for generations. An Asian elephant moving through India or Thailand is not only a survivor of modern habitat loss. It is also the living cousin nearest to mammoths. The categories remain useful, but they no longer feel simple. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson ancient DNA keeps teaching. The past is not obligated to fit the shapes we prefer. Nature does not preserve our categories out of courtesy. It leaves fragments, and sometimes the fragments disagree. A tusk says one thing. A tooth says another. A gene buried in old bones says, start again. So when we ask where elephants came from, the most honest answer is no longer a straight line from an ancestral form to the species we know. It is a long African beginning, yes, but also dispersal, divergence, return, mixture, survival, and loss. It is forests and open country, Eurasian migrations, island dwarfs, ice age cousins, and living species that carry the memory of extinct ones inside their genomes. The old picture was cleaner. The new one is truer, and in some ways far more moving, because it tells us that the animals still alive today are not the final, obvious products of a solved story. They are the remaining sentences of a much larger epic, one we only started reading properly when the dead began to speak in DNA. If you enjoy documentaries that follow those buried revisions all the way to their consequences, you're welcome to stay with this channel. The next time you see an elephant, it may look ancient in the familiar way, massive, calm, almost monumental. But now there is something else standing inside that image. A hidden map of lost migrations, misread skeletons, extinct encounters, and a family history far stranger than we were ever taught to imagine.